Welcome to the Biological Medicine 101 webinar. We're really happy that you're here and listening to it. I'm Heather Schofield, Education Director here at Biomed, and we're really excited to be able to have this topic presented. One of the very foundations and roots of Biomed is actually rooted within biological medicine. Many of the lines that we educate on and that we have available all can be included into what is known as biological medicine, and that includes Pleomorphism and Isopathic theory, psychosomatic energetics and Rubimed therapy, Nesman, drainage and detoxification, and then a lot of other options that affect the microbiome and affect the terrain and get the body back into regulation. Dr. Thomas Rau from the Paracelsus Clinic was known to be said, the special point about European biological medicine is the disease of the organ remains in the background in contrast to the reestablishment of the dynamic, regulative condition of the whole patient. Okay, so that's a pretty big mouthful, and the reason I wanted to mention that is because Dr. Melina Roberts is going to be talking about biological medicine tonight, and she's going to make that sentence very clear, and so that you have an understanding of why the terrain is so important, and reestablishing that regulation in the body is what the goal is as biological medicine. I am also really honored to introduce you to the amazingly knowledgeable naturopathic doctor, Melina Roberts. She's a leading authority, a TEDx speaker, and an international lecturer on optimizing health from the microbiome and the microenvironment. She uses European biological medicine to address all types of health for women, children, digestion, autoimmune, complex chronic disease, mood and health, and as a natural option for cancer treatment. She's the author of the book Building a Healthy Child and the host of the popular podcast Building Health with Dr. Melina Roberts. We sure do hope that you enjoy this Biological Medicine 101 webinar. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Roberts.
All right. Thank you, Heather, so much for the kind introduction. And I'm excited to talk about biological medicine because biological medicine has played such a huge role in my life and really changed the way I practice. This is a little bit about me, but really, like when I start thinking about it, I wonder, like, how did I really get into biological medicine? And what happened was that when I was in my second year at the naturopathic college, my dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And that started my journey to really start doing a whole bunch of research into cancer care because I really didn't know anything about how to treat cancer. And unfortunately, my dad passed away 9 months later. But that really did start my journey into researching and trying to understand what was going on in terms of cancer. And when I graduated from the naturopathic college, I heard that there was this clinic in Toronto that was having a lot of success in treating cancer. So I went and visited this clinic, and I saw that what they were doing at this clinic was that everything that they were doing at the clinic was nothing that I had learned at school. It was all very different things. And what I learned was that it was a biological medicine clinic. So I actually joined this clinic, and I just wanted to learn everything that they were doing because I knew that they were having success in treating cancer, and I wanted to learn what they were doing, and I wanted to have that kind of success as well. And as I was kind of trying to figure out what they were doing, the owner of the clinic, he said, well, you really need to go to this one lecture. So this one weekend lecture. So I drove down to Marion, Massachusetts, and the person who was lecturing at this conference was Dr. Thomas Rau, talking about European biological medicine. And I was so impressed. I was like, okay, I got to learn this. This makes so much sense to me, and I want to figure out what they're doing there. And I signed up and I did the 2-year postgraduate training in European biological medicine through the Paracelsus Clinic in Switzerland. And that has really formed the foundation of how I think about any sort of disease process and health, and it shaped the way I practice. I use all the different testing and therapies in biological medicine, and it's really even shaped the way I think about the world, and like a real paradigm shift, because even with what's going on in the world right now is, like there was no part of me that was scared, because I thought, well, I just have to make sure that my body is not a good host to any sort of infectious agents. So I just had to work on not being a good host to any sort of infectious agents. So I'll explain that more as we get into biological medicine. But for a lot of people, even coming from a naturopathic point of view, it's a real paradigm shift into biological medicine. So that's what I want to get into. And what I was able to kind of dig up was an old photo of me. Uh, at one of the times I went to go visit Dr. Rao in Switzerland. So this is me with Dr. Rao. And one of the main statements he always says is, to treat differently, one must think differently. And that's what I want to introduce you to, is just even a different way of thinking when you think of biological medicine. So in terms of biological medicine, what we see is that we see the human body as this dynamic microsystem. And our bodies are a dynamic system that's constantly breaking down and building back up. And we have daily stressors that we come across. So that's everything from the foods we eat to the air we breathe, the water we drink, the things that we put on our body, our personal care products, whether we're taking medications, whether those are over-the-counter medications or prescription medications. We come across the EMFs, and really we can't get away from them. We're just bombarded with them on a daily basis, and we get exposure to pathogens. We also have mental emotional stressors, and the psychological component, the mental emotional stressors, are definitely a big part of biological medicine. I think that a lot of different therapies don't necessarily focus on the psychological component, but definitely with naturopathic or with biological medicine, we focus on and take that into consideration a lot, is that mental emotional stressor component. And when we have those stressors, then our body needs to adapt. So we have physiological and we have hormonal changes that happen, and our body needs to adapt to all of these different stressors on our body. And how our body will adapt is that we have this dynamic, like, microenvironment in our system. And that dynamic microenvironment is we can call it our mesenchyme or our interstitium. It like interweaves all the tissues, and it connects all the organs to each other. And our lymphatic system actually, and the lymph actually flows through it. And this is like where all the information is carried. And this is where all of our autonomic nervous system functions actually work. And through that dynamic system, our body has to be able to self-regulate. So our body needs to be able to self-regulate in order to self-heal. So if this system is actually working well, if our body is in a healthy state, then our body has that dynamic regulation, and our body is actually, if our body can see the stressor, properly adapt, properly self-heal, then our body is actually in balance and healthy. So this is what health looks like. We see a stressor, we adapt, our body self-regulates, self-heals. Now, when we get into biological medicine approach, I'm going to go through the 6 fundamental paradigms. And when we think about biological medicine, it's really focused on looking at, the deepest biological roots. So we really treat, not just, we don't say just the root cause, but we're looking at like those deepest problems, those deepest imbalances in the body. And the therapies we use are in harmony with like our natural healing capacities. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to restore the capacity of the body to be able to regulate itself, regenerate, adapt, self-heal. And, well, a lot of people will say, but is this based on science? And this is definitely all scientifically based. We, and one of the big differences with biological medicine is that we focus on that internal terrain, that internal milieu, that biological terrain, because that needs to be in balance. That's really the focus of biological medicine, is getting that internal milieu into balance. And when we can do this, then we can restore the integrity of really every system of the body. So getting into the first one, which is the first fundamental paradigm, is that illness is the presentation of toxic overload resultant from a homeostasis block. So the way that Dr. Rao really describes the body is this barrel of toxins. So over a lifetime, we accumulate a barrel of toxins. And then when that barrel starts to overload, when that barrel starts to spill over of the toxins, that's typically when we'll start to see symptoms. And those toxins can be everything from food sensitivities, immune challenges, heavy metals, environmental toxins, everything emotional, as well as everything physical. So those are all the things that could be blocking proper regulation of the system. And so what we need to do is we need to be working on identifying what those stressors are, and then remove those stressors so that we can allow the body to be able to function the way it was designed to function. So understanding that illness happens when we have an overload of toxins, and when we have that overload of toxins, it's throwing off the homeostasis, that balance of the body. And then within my clinic, one of the things I look for, or one of the things I test, is something called heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is testing it's assessing the autonomic nervous system. So that's the part of the nervous system that runs in the background, and it has 2 parts. It has that stress state, so your sympathetic part of your nervous system, and it has your parasympathetic part of your nervous system, which is your rest, digest, and repair. And what needs to happen in order for our bodies to be healthy is that autonomic nervous system is actually regulating that heart rate. And the more variable your heart rate is, the more adaptable our systems are. So if you look at that bottom part of the picture, you can see that even just the difference between those heart rates is just, even though it's just like points of a second, that variability is the autonomic nervous system just constantly balancing out that heart rate. And so it's very adaptable. And so then we got the pictures of the chameleons. And the chameleons, you can see when the chameleon is healthy, it's able to adapt to its environment. But if it's not healthy, then it's not adapting to its environment. And we can really see that when we do things like heart rate variability, is that we can find out how adaptable the human body is. And the more adaptable it is, the healthier we are, and the less variability there is, the more rigid our systems are. So this is a good way for us to check that human health. Now, as we head into number two, the number two is that disease is an expression of dysregulation and consequently uh, degenerative processes. So what a healthy body would do is that when we have health, our body, if we come across any sort of toxic load, our body will naturally start to detoxify. So our body will start to try to move those toxic loads out through our urine, through our stool, through our perspiration, through our breath, through our mucus. Those are just natural ways that your body's trying to move toxic loads out. And if it's not capable of doing this, then toxic loads will actually start to move deeper into our tissues. And then we will start to see more problems start to arise. And one of the great doctors who was able to explain this so well is a doctor named Dr. Reckwig. And Dr. Reckwig, he is the one who explains homotoxicology, and really like a blend of pleomorphism, which I'm going to talk more about, and homotoxicology is a perfect way for us to be able to really explain biological medicine. But homotoxicology is a great way to explain disease progression. And Dr. Reckwig, he talks about how we first have like this excretion phase, and then if our body isn't effectively able to excrete that toxin, then the toxins start to move deeper into our tissues, and so then they get deposited into different systems of our body. And then if that continues, then we start to see degeneration. So we have a toxic buildup within different tissues of our body, and it doesn't allow the body to be able to function that well. So then we start to get degeneration because those cells just aren't working as well. And this is beautifully put into these like 6 phases of homotoxicology. Is that, you have your excretion phase, then inflammation. Inflammation's a good thing if it's working well. We just don't want chronic inflammation. And if the inflammation isn't the way to kind of get rid of symptoms in the body, then our body starts to deposit it into tissues. Then we get that impregnation phase, then we get the degenerative phase, and then we get the de-differentiation phase, which is more when you see like chronic disease and cancer start to happen. So you can see that toxins are just moving deeper and deeper into the tissues if the body's not able to effectively move it out. Now, this is Dr. Reckwig's phase, and you can just see different systems of the body. I always find it pretty interesting because you can just go through those different systems of the body. You can just see how deep things are going. Like if you look at the skin, you'll see sweat, then eczema, pigmentation, then you can see lupus, precancerous issues, and then skin cancer. So you can just kind of see with each system of the body how it progresses to being more superficial to being deep into those tissues. And this is typically how I will explain how that's working and how toxins kind of infiltrate into our internal milieu, is that we have these exogenous toxins and endogenous and exogenous toxins, and they move into our blood, and then we have our built-in detox pathways. And ideally, if they're working well, then those toxins will exit the body. But if they're not working that well, then they move into the internal milieu, which is all the area around our cells. If they start to build up even more in that internal milieu, then they move into the cells space. And then when they're inside those cells, that's when they can actually affect DNA and how they can actually affect a lot of disease processes at the DNA level. So then we move into another phase, which is another key factor in terms of biological medicine, which is disturbance foci. And these disturbance foci can trigger and exacerbate chronic disease. And so disturbance foci are these local places in the body that harbor a low grade, often undetected chronic infection. And they're usually happening in like poorly vascular tissue, and they can act as a physical or a chemical barrier to how the immune system functions. So what can happen is that with those foci, those like local foci, they can actually start to deplete the immune system as your body tries to fight off those kind of low grade infections. And they deplete the immune system, they deplete the body's resources, and they can be one of the underlying issues to why we have a chronic disease, because your body's trying to work on that low grade infection, and so then it's not focused on other processes in the body. So some of the examples of these foci disturbances can be, one of the big ones is dead or root canal teeth. And with biological medicine, one of the focuses, or where one of the great partnerships in terms of biological medicine, is working with a biological dentist. So it's a dentist who actually understands that what happens in the mouth can have a huge effect on the rest of the body. And root canals are definitely an example of that. And, like I never really knew much about root canals until I learned about biological medicine, and there's a big dental component. And you learn that, each tooth is like it's basically its own organ, because each tooth has its own blood supply, it has its own nerve supply, and it has its own blood supply. And what happens with a root canal is that you sever the blood supply, nerve supply, and lymphatic drainage of that tooth, but you leave the tooth within the mouth. And so what happens is that tooth continues to break down and can be a place where you can harbor infection. So it's typically just left in for aesthetic reasons, and sometimes it's put in because in order to keep the jawline, or in order to have that tooth to chew. But in most cases, root canals, or I'm going to say in all cases, root canals are just not a great option. But understanding that these can be disturbance foci in the body. Other things could be, we can have old scars, the tonsils can be a spot, the nasal sinuses, having that chronic dysbiosis, that imbalance of the gut flora, can be one of those foci disturbances. We could have surgical wounds, and one of the other ones is gallbladder, because gallbladder can also be a place. And I did a whole webinar just on the gallbladder, and I talked about that because it's a poorly vascularized tissues, and often infections can harbor within that gallbladder. And so these understanding that these disturbances, these foci disturbances, can be one of the root causes of chronic disease. Now, the challenge with these disruptive foci is um, often they'll only show up, or the only way for you to find them is using some subtle regulatory tests. And some of those tests can be things like electrodermal screening, some of the milieu tests like the dark field microscopy, and thermography is another way that we can check for those to find those foci. And these disruptive fields can lie dormant for years. So they can, in some cases, not even be problematic. But these are, some other examples that can be causing these, and these disruptive foci can cause blockages to regulation. So here are some other examples. It can be the mercury or heavy metals in the metal amalgams in the mouth. And just to kind of put you actually want to see a biological dentist if you want to get that mercury removed, because you want to make sure that it's taken out properly. Um, uh, often, often in a lot of cases, if it's not taken out properly, it can actually cause more problems within your system. So I think that's really important. That's something that I often will talk about with my patients is I don't want just any dentist to be removing those metal amalgams from your mouth. I want you to see a biological dentist who's going to take all the precautions to make sure that when they're removing that mercury, that it's not making you sicker. There can also be, we got chemical toxins, preservatives in the foods we're eating. Sometimes we can have like dead teeth, or we can have infections in that jawline. We can have that dysbiosis in the intestines. Sometimes in that, when we're looking at the blood underneath the microscope, you can see that the cells are all stuck together. So they look like it's called rolla. So it's when the cells are all stacked on top of each other like a stack of coins. And they really shouldn't be like that. They should be nicely separated. And this can be like a huge problem within the system, but this is a huge sign that there's a hyperacidity in the system, that there's a high amount of inflammation going on in the body. And then we can have some other things going on like trace elements. We can have some deficiencies. We can have some deficiencies in fatty acids. And then there can also be that psychological chronic overload. And we always have to take that into consideration too, that can also be a contributing factor to why the system isn't functioning well. Now, now it's always important to understand, and it'd be so much easier if it wasn't, but all diseases are actually multi-causal. It's not just one thing that's causing the problem. There's usually a number of causes to any sort of, especially chronic disease or complex chronic diseases. Um, and and what's interesting is that it's usually also dependent on the constitution of the patient. So in biological medicine, we really talk a lot about constitution, that every person has a specific constitution, and they have a general tendency towards to different disease processes in the body. So they have different susceptibilities based on their constitution, which doesn't always happen in other natural therapies. They don't always talk about constitution. So I think that's an important deciphering factor to how biological medicine works. Um, so biological medicine itself is similar to naturopathic medicine. It's just a deeper emphasis on looking at regulation, looking at terrain, and we're looking at, identifying those blockages to regulation and removing those blockages and allowing the body to be able to self-regulate and self-heal. So, in terms of those constitutions, um, Dr. Rao, he talks about those constitutions, and talks about how there's, specific themes and emotional themes over a lifetime. Um, and and uh, Dr. Enderlein, who I'm going to be talking about in more detail soon, he talks about that there's like three main constitutions. And I'm going to go into those in more detail too, because that's pretty interesting to be able to see those different constitutions. Now, another important factor is understanding that nutrition is really important. And in terms of nutrition, um, nutrition plays such a huge role in influencing the shift of the milieu and improving our regulatory excretion, absorption, and circulation. The challenge is that nutrition is also one of the most difficult things to implement with our patients, and it's usually, for me, it's the most challenging part of our program is changing people's diets, but it plays probably one of the biggest roles in how our systems function, because with proper nutrition, we need that proper nutrition as those building blocks in order for our body to be able to renew itself, to rebuild itself, and to be able to rebuild our system stronger. So our nutrition is our building blocks, and if we're not properly able to give our bodies the proper building blocks, then we can't properly heal and regenerate. So this is where nutrition plays such a huge role in how our systems function. And that means that in order that first of all, we need to be taking in the right nutrition, but we also need a digestive tract that can properly absorb the nutrients from the foods we're eating. So we also need to be looking at that gut health. We need to be looking at making sure that um, the microbiome, oh, actually, I think I'm jumping ahead a little bit. When I'll talk about gut health, but we need our gut to be in really good balance in order for us to properly absorb those nutrients from the foods we're eating. So this also means that we need to be eating all of the right foods. And so we need to be looking into what those food intolerances are. We need to work on balancing out the gut, and we need to make sure that the walls of the gut are intact so that we can properly absorb those nutrients. So one of the key things is that we need to be removing some of those major inflammatory foods. And those major inflammatory foods are things like dairy, wheat, high amounts of animal proteins, and sugar in the diet, because those can all be causing inflammation. And remember, it's nutrition that has that huge influence on shifting that milieu. And the other key factor is our intestinal health. Our intestinal health is also extremely important in how our bodies function. So we need the correct foods to be that proper building block for our body. And we also need a good balance of that microbiome. So that microbiome, the healthy bacteria in our gut help to detoxify us. They help to pre-digest a lot of those foods we're eating. They help to properly detoxify. They help us to have strong immune systems. So, like really, like biological medicine, we've been talking about that microbiome, which it's now referred to as. We've been talking about that microbiome for years before it became trendy. I know now, there's lots of studies on it. Lots of people are talking about the microbiome. But, I remember Dr. Rao talking about this. Now, I guess it's probably been about, 17 years ago. And I think he was probably talking about it years before that. Um, so those microorganisms that live in our gut, they also act like sponges, so they help to grab on to toxic loads and help to effectively move them out. And I'm going to be talking more about the isopathic therapies, but these are different ways that we can help to take care of that intestinal flora. We can do it with like isopathic therapies. We can do it with trace elements. We can make sure we're removing those food sensitivities. We need to work on that acid-base balance and, the fiber-rich foods. So these are just different ways that we can make sure that we take care of that microflora, and realizing that when we support that intestinal, we need to support that intestinal mucosa and be able to support that microbiome or that microflora within the gut. Now, there's a special therapy, which is those isopathic therapy, and they play such a huge role in terms of biological medicine. They play a big role in terms of our acid-base balance through our milieu, balancing that milieu. And that milieu is really like those spaces between our cells. It's that environment that our cells live in. And in order for our cells to be healthy, they need a healthy environment to live in. So we need to really be focusing on balancing up that milieu, that terrain. And these isopathic remedies really help us to be able to balance that. And it's supporting, the immune system. We can use it for many different things. We can use it for acute and chronic degenerative diseases. It's really true that it's treating the cause and not the symptoms, and it's safe, non-toxic. It has no side effects. And really, what isopathic remedies are is they're based on the theory that that a causative agent or its byproducts can stimulate the immune response and provoke this pleomorphic regulatory shift. So I'm going to talk, in order to really understand isopathic therapy, you really need to understand pleomorphism. So that's what I'm going to talk about next, because I think that plays a big role in terms of biological medicine. And just understanding a little bit of the history of pleomorphism. So there's that pleomorphic perspective, and that is that the internal environment, so that internal environment within our body is responsible for any sort of infectious, in order for that infectious agent or inflammatory or degenerative physiology to be established, it's all dependent on that internal environment. So Dr. Enderlein, he was a professor of biology, he was a microbiologist, he was a researcher, and he did extensive research. And then he concluded that the pleomorphic perspective on disease is really the correct one. And what he did was he just observed living particles under the dark field microscopy, and he didn't use anything, he didn't add any stains or any agents to it. And he was really noticing that there was significant changes of those different particles under the microscope, just depending on the environment that they were in. And this happened in a really predictable way. And it happened if there was changes in the cellular and the extracellular environment. So pleomorphism is quite fascinating. And let's just compare that. So there's like the monomorphism, and that is based on the understanding that bacteria appear in a constant growth form and they can't change. And that microbes, they're just one type, there's just each type only produces one specific disease. There's one form equals one function. And it's really based on, it is the microbe that causes disease. And this is what conventional medicine still uses today. It's that monomorphic idea of health. Now, pleomorphism stemmed, from, I'm going to say, Béchamp and Enderlein were some of the pioneers in understanding pleomorphism. Béchamp said, the microbe is nothing, the terrain is everything. And Enderlein, which I'll talk about more about his research, but he talks about how the milieu is everything. And it is based on the understanding that microorganisms go through different stages of development and evolve into various growth forms within a single life cycle. And so it's just the capacity of these organisms to be able to change in structure and behavior and complexity in response to a changing and dynamic environment. So, and what's interesting is that I think a lot of people think of like pleomorphism is this life cycle transformation, sort of like that metamorphism, like how a caterpillar gets changed into a butterfly. But it's different than that because with that metamorphism, it can only move in one direction. It just moves towards that adult form. You can't move from a butterfly back to the caterpillar. But with pleomorphism, it's different because you can, based on the environment, it can actually change back and forth in form and function just based on that changing environment. So that's one of the big changes with pleomorphism. And yeah, so this pleomorphism was developed by Dr. Enderlein, and I think the rumor is that Bastier on his deathbed said that Enderlein was correct, that the milieu is everything. That's how the rumor goes. But he really focused on the milieu, and what he did was studied thousands of samples of microscopic organisms and living tissues, and he conducted experiments, and he observed in real time that there was changes under different parameters. So if the environment changed, then these little like microscopic organisms changed in a really predictable fashion. And when you change that environment, you could actually change how that microscopic organism, whether it developed or whether it went back to what I call it that natural, normal, low valence form. So, so really what can happen is that as that environment, as that milieu, that internal milieu gets more acidic, then those forms, those microscopic organisms can actually change, so they're actually more pathogenic, so they're more problematic in the body. And this is some of how he described it. He described it as that there's these protids, and you can see like in this dark field microscopy, the protids this is actually a cluster of protids, even just that little dot there, and they're the smallest indestructible protein particle that's present in really like all living things, so in plants and warm-blooded animals. And then we can start to see, and I'm going to go through these different forms on a different slide here. Because what you'll see is that, first of all, you see the protids, which is just like, they just look like little dots in the dark field microscopy, which is really interesting. And then when they become more clusters, they're symprotids. These are just names that Enderlein gave to these little like microorganisms. And then, so at those stages, if you look on just like the left side, is just when they're kind of just like little dots, they're not pathological. They're not causing any problems with the body. That's in its normal, natural form. But as the blood, as that environment becomes more acidic, what happens is that they start to become more pathogenic. So they start to form into these little villi, and then they become it looks like they kind of look like a circle with a line on it, those chondrids, and then they start to form, they kind of form like these little sacs, and those are signs when you're seeing that in the blood. Those are signs that the body's in more of a degenerative state, and it's also a sign that the body is in a really more acidic state at the same time. And then this is the cycle. So you'll see that same cycle of the mucor and how it evolves, but then the mucor will break off into that aspergillus stage, and then it goes through a cycle, and then it starts to cause problems within the system. And you can see this is some of the constitutions, and that's what Enderlein recognized. Was he recognized within like that pleomorphism that there was constitutions that people will, certain people were kind of more susceptible to different constitutions. And so there was the constitution which was mucor, and that mucor is more that congested state. So it's that person who you can see it as like that person who's more susceptible to cardiovascular issues. Typically, that mucor pictures that person who's more overweight, tends to have like high blood pressure and high cholesterol. That would be more that mucor constitution. And then there's that aspergillus constitution, which is more that structural one. So there are structural issues. They're more prone to things like osteoporosis and degenerative disease. And the aspergillus person tends to be like that. They think of it more as like that skinny female. As that aspergillus kind of picture, and that aspergillus, it's usually that skinny person who tends to look actually older than they actually are. And then there's the penicillium constitution, and that's more that inflammatory. So that's the people who tend to get like chronic infections, and that's where that constitution is. So just going into those in more detail, which I find really interesting, because when I'm looking at the blood underneath the microscope, you can actually see these differences in people, and often it's not really, we draw those pictures of what that person who's a mucor can look like, but sometimes looking at their blood underneath the microscope is very different than what that person actually looks like. Um, so seeing their blood underneath the microscope really helps me to figure out what constitution a person is. What the mucor is more the flow, or sometimes it's, that lack of flow. It's the stickiness of the blood, and we get a lot of that fibrin formation, so the blood just isn't flowing as freely. So we have a decrease in that blood viscosity and its proper circulation. And with that, you end up with things like thrombosis, atherosclerosis. This is where you see congestion. You'll see infarctions, like the heart attacks. And when we see this, and this is called truly preventative medicine, when you see this, we can do supportive therapy. So you can use things like Pleomorphism is great. Right now we have it as an eye drop, so you can actually just use the eye drops as that Pleomorphism. Pleosanivus pairs perfectly with this in terms of that mucor picture. And then helping with that, the lymphatic system is what flows through that interstitium. So that's all the spaces in between our cells. So we want to get that flowing a lot easier. And one of the ways to reduce the congestion of the lymphatic system was with something like a lymphodrop. And then the nattokinase is something that helps to break up or reduce that fibrin in the body. And then we got the salve tonic, which helps to increase circulation and improve circulation overall. And then we have the aspergillus, and aspergillus is more the structural part. And so when we're seeing the structures, we see that we're having issues more with the bones and the tendons. It's tends to be the person who's more prone to like osteoporosis. And then we see what we can use is the different remedies are like the aspergillus nigra, pleocitro is what pairs well for the aspergillus, and then we can use different remedies like the solidago, the bucco, and the bronca, just depending on which system is affected with this particular person. And then there's the serapeptase, which helps to break down any of those inflammatory factors in the body, and that works well for the aspergillus person. And then there's the penicillium. And so this is the person who's more inflamed. And you can see that when you're having that inflammation in the body, that you want to be helping to, you see more of that infectious agents in the body. And, you know, you can do that with different supportive therapies. And so there's those different forms in terms of pleomorphism is that, you know, we have the existence of those endobiotic, that pleomorphism is, you know, just depending on that environment, we will see like the upward evolution of bacteria, fungi, and viruses. The importance of how the milieu plays in terms of how that upward evolution happens. And what's interesting is that, and this is where the isopathic remedies really come into play, is that you can have a reduction in those high valences, so those more pathological microorganisms in the blood by introducing the low valences. So that's what those isopathics helps do. They introduce those low valences and it actually reduces those high valences. So it helps to down regulate those more pathological forms. And then there's the existence of those blockages that favor this development. So you actually want to work on improving those blockages. And the isopathic remedies, and I see I'm running out of time here. So those isopathic remedies, you know, what's happening is that we have these pathological, and you can see this in the dark field, if they're causing more of a problem in the system, and by introducing those isopathic, it helps to actually down regulate any of those microorganisms that are at that high valence. So that's what those isopathics help to do. And there's really like no other remedies out there that have that kind of effect that are based on Enderlein's work. And that's what Enderlein found in his research with dark field microscopy, is that the microenvironment played a big role in how those like pleomorphic forms started to move up into more of those complex and those more pathogenic valences, those higher valences. But by introducing those lower valences, that he was able to down regulate those more pathogenic valences. So I hope that makes sense. And so that's really what, yeah, we're starting to see. And a big thing is that the internal milieu shift is just plays such a huge role in how our systems function. So we need to, in order to make that shift, and this is something I'm really strict about with my patients, is that we can have no sugar, no cow's dairy. I also do no wheat because that's a major inflammatory food, because we need to shift the body from being more acidic to being more alkaline, because that's a big part of it. And that's one of the challenges too, is that we can use those isopathics to bring down those higher valences. But in order for us to actually have long-term effects on restoring the milieu, we actually need to be doing that. We actually need to be making nutritional changes, and we have to be making those changes. Those milieu changes have to happen in order for us to actually have a long-term shift. So that's where we really need to focus on that internal milieu. And as Enderline would say, the milieu is everything, and we have to change that milieu in order for us to not have those pleomorphic, those more problematic, those pathological forms change. We have to change that milieu. We have to change that terrain that our cells are living in. And one of the huge ways we can do that is through diet, and then we can also do it through these different supplement pathways. And we also need to work on cleaning up any of that toxic load that's accumulating in the milieu. And we can do that with different helping to support different detox pathways and making sure we move that toxic load that gets accumulated in that milieu. And then we can use those isopathic therapies to help to modulate. And then we can use these organic acids, which are pretty amazing. Those organic acids, we have physiological lactic acid. So that's the lactic acid that is it's actually healthy, and so it's the organic, the L plus lactic acid will help to flush out the more pathological lactic acid that's formed from sugar fermentation and anaerobic metabolism. And so that's what like the Pleomorphism will help to do, is it'll help to actually flush out any of that more pathological lactic acid and move that out of our systems, so that really cleaning up that milieu. And then that acid-base balance, things like, so this is just talking about that Pleomorphism is going to help to move out that lactic acid. The Pleocitro also helps to shift that milieu. It's another organic acid that helps to move out those anaerobic metabolism. And this one works really well with people who are exhibiting more of that aspergillus constitution. And in order for us to have like basically long-term benefit, we need to actually be working on the milieu as a long-term plan, not just as a short-term plan. And so this is, probably the challenge in our therapies, is that it has to be a long-term plan. And understanding that our bodies are dynamic biological systems that are constantly regulating and regenerating. And in order for us to be healthy, we need to make sure that we work on building that healthy terrain. I know I'm running out of time, but one of the examples I like to use is that in order for if we have a plant, if we want that plant to be healthy, or if that plant is sick, what we need to do is we need to change the soil that that plant is in order to help that plant to regain health. And that's really what we have to do in order for to keep our cells healthy. We need to clean up the terrain that it lives in. So if we create a quality garden, we can improve the health of our cells, and we can help our cells to be able to regenerate new healthy cells. And so these are just other therapies that I use in my practice, and there's just a number of different things we can do, and they're all affecting that internal terrain and making sure that we support detox pathways, we clean up that terrain, we help with proper cell membrane function, we help to move lymphatic systems out. So these are just a number of different therapies that I'll use within my practice, but all working in terms of supporting that internal terrain and making sure that our systems are in a better balance, because we're addressing the actual terrain of the body. So I hope that you found that helpful, and that just gave you some oversight of what biological medicine is. And this is just a bit about me. And if you need to reach me, these are all the different ways you can reach me and follow me on social media. And I thank Biomed very much for allowing me to do this talk. And I thank all of you for being here and attending and taking time out of your nights in order to be here and learn about biological medicine. And I hope you found this helpful. And I will pass the mic over to Heather.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. That was very thorough and a really good introduction to what biological medicine is, especially with the emphasis that you put on the fact that it's really about thinking a little bit differently, or a lot differently, and it's very much about the terrain and getting the body back into regulation. So we have a number of questions, and what I will do is invite everybody, if you do have a question for Dr. Roberts, if you could either type it into the chat room or into the Q&A section, then we can have Dr. Roberts answer those for you. I know we have a few in here right now. Okay. Here. Okay. Fantastic lecture. What is your favorite tool or device to measure heart rate variability?
Well, I have, and then I have a machine within my clinic that checks for heart rate variability. And I'm not sure if you're asking the brand name, but I don't remember the brand name of the machine I use. I could definitely get that information from you. I actually just need, like, I'm in my clinic right now. I just need to go to the other room and look at who the supplier is. I don't know if that's the detail you want, but like, I have a machine within my clinic that checks for heart rate variability, which I find to be very reliable.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. I know there's different ones available out there, so it might be nice just to know the one that you're using, because I'm sure that there's different devices that do different things, and some may be better than others.
Yes, for sure.
All right. So, oh yes, okay. So Laura asks, what sort of structures do we see in the blood under dark field for the Aspergillus constitution?
So for Aspergillus constitution, you tend to see more crystal formations. So the crystals underneath the microscope kind of look like broken glass. They're usually really shiny, and they can come in different forms. They can also come in different colors. But usually when you're seeing some of those crystals, it's also an indication that the kidneys aren't working at their best, because the kidneys should be able to filter out those crystal formations. And if they're not able to filter out those crystal formations, then what we see is we see the crystals showing up in the blood. So often what I will do just when I see those crystals is work on the kidneys. And one of the remedies I really like for the kidneys is Solidago, because that tends to work quite well for that aspergillus picture. So usually like a combination of that aspergillus, um, the aspergillus nigra, and then the Pleocitro and the Solidago work really well together to treat that crystal formation.
Great.
So,
That's a good explanation. I know we have some dark field books available through Biomed that have some good resources as far as photos and pictures to be able to show the different structures or what different blood pictures look like under the different constitutions. And if I remember correctly, Dr. Roberts, this is very much what Dr. Rao does at the Paracelsus Clinic, and also how often the dark field of biological medicine in Europe is practiced.
yeah, definitely. Like dark field microscopy is like an integral part of biological medicine, especially at the Paracelsus Clinic with Dr. Rao.
Great. Okay, and so we've got a couple other questions here. So Erin has a hard time describing to patients about toxins, as they kind of want to know more specifics. And so the question just was kind of a general question, like, do you have some tips on how to describe toxins to patients? Is there a tip on how to look to see how toxins are being excreted by these patients? And just generally, how would you describe this type of thing?
So I describe it as I describe it as that there's basically like I put them into 6 categories. I call them 6 stressors on the body, and so I say that there's food intolerances, immune challenges, heavy metals, environmental toxins, everything emotional, and everything physical. And so those can all be toxins within the body. And then we have our normal, natural ways of properly excreting toxins. And we do that through our urine, through our stools, through our sweat, through our breath. So those are just different ways that our body will release toxic loads. And then if we aren't able to do that effectively, then that's when that toxic load will tend to move into deeper systems. And the reason our body is doing that is more of a protective mechanism. And that protective mechanism is just to move that toxic load out of circulation. So, because if we have a buildup of that toxic load within our bloodstream, then it's actually, it could actually like be detrimental to our health. It could actually kill us. And so it's a protective mechanism that we move that toxic load into our tissues and out of circulation. I don't know if that's kind of what you're looking for, but that's usually how I would explain it to patients.
I think that's a good general one. And Erin, I just made a note of this. So Dr. Roberts has done some really good drainage and detox webinars for us in the past, including many other ones. And within those webinars in the slides, there's some really good lists, what she just mentioned, with her 6 categories, and some more specifics about that and some of the science and anatomy and physiology behind it. So that might be a really good resource for you to be able to get some of that information going as well. And I know within those presentations, Dr. Roberts also does have lists of toxins available as well. Okay, so then with Aesculus, do you have any experience using Aesculus helping in the mucor condition?
I'm going to say no. I don't have I'm trying to think of what remedy that is.
Aesculus is one of the Nestin remedies that works on venous congestion, and it often is indicated in general circulation, hemorrhoids, varicose veins. I had responded back to Linda just saying that, with the mucor condition, Aesculus might be helpful, but the Pleomuc drops plus Sanavis plus potentially nattokinase for fibrin and lymphatic drainage
Yeah,
would
I
be
will.
the
Yeah, I
best.
tend to use more of like the lymphodrop for that mucor condition,
Yeah.
and then sometimes I would use like a LAPA.
Yep, yep. And that's kind of the thing is you want to get things flowing again, the blood flowing, the lymph flowing, and that's the technique with that.
Yeah.
Um, and Linda also just asks about using live blood analysis or dark field. What kind of indicators are you looking for milieu conditions overall?
Sorry, was in general or
Yeah, just this is an in general
in
question.
general? Yeah, so in general, how I describe it is that those your red blood cells, you want them to be perfectly round, all about the same size and nicely spaced out. And then you want to have your white blood cells to be like little vacuum cleaners, and you want your white blood cells to clean up all the spaces, and all the spaces in the background should be nice and clear. So that would be an ideal picture. And my ideal picture is on I think, or the second last slide.
Okay, second
Um,
last slide. Let me move that for you.
are you able to move it to the second last slide? And you can see
Yeah.
like oh yeah, you
Okay.
just went past it right
There
there.
we go.
So
Good.
that is ideal. And that is, yeah, that's ideally what we want the blood to look like. And often what I do is I say, because I have their blood up on a big screen TV, and I will say, like, this is what your blood looks like. But the beautiful thing about this is that everything about this is changeable. And what we want to do is we want to shift your blood so it looks like what it does on the screen to looking like this beautiful ideal picture. And then once we can make that shift, people start feeling better and health just starts to improve. So, seeing both those pictures really helps people to realize, okay, yes, my blood looks like that, but if I make these changes, I can actually have a proactive role in my health, and I can actually help that milieu to change. So, I think it's important to know what ideal looks like.
Perfect. That's great. And then we've got one final question here. Actually, we've got, one final question here, and it's just regarding gingiva and bridge work in the mouth. And if there is a remedy or recommendation that you would recommend. Michelle's asking about Pleoalb, and I just mentioned back to her, Pleopef is the better option for in the mouth because that's more in line with the fungal overburden that can happen in the mouth. So she says, what would you suggest in conjunction with Pleopef for someone who has gingivitis and issues with bridge work? I guess that's a general thing as well.
Yeah, that's a general question as well. Yeah, it's figuring out because there's probably like some some underlying inflammation that's going on. And yeah, so I think that, you know, um, you want to take care of that acutely, and you can do that with the pleos, and you can do that even with um, some nutrients or trace minerals, or even if you just take some of the the pleo alcala powder, and you just take the pleo alcala powder, and some of the ways you could do it is either you can kind of swish it around in your mouth, or the other thing you can do is kind of make it into like a little bit of a paste where you just add it to some water, and then you have it as a paste and you just put it onto that spot. That can be used like acutely, so that can work well acutely. And then you got to figure out like what's going on at the underlying issue. And I find that I always find that gut health is huge in addressing those underlying issues. And balancing out the microbiome, healing up the gut with things like the NAG, and then making sure that those detox pathways work well, with whatever organ system is not working well, but usually lymphatic system is helping to drain the head and neck. So you want to do some lymph draw works well in that case. So yeah, those are just some suggestions just based on what you're telling me right now.
Great. That sounds good. Nice and in line with biological medicine techniques, change the terrain and support the microbiome.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so with that said, I've got one final kind of question, and then we will conclude for tonight. So Kayla is asking, hi, Dr. Roberts, do you offer training in dark field microscopy and biological medicine at your Alberta clinic?
I guess I don't formally at the moment, but I always think that like one of the best ways is to actually come in for an appointment on yourself, and then you can learn so much just from looking at your own blood and doing it. But maybe in the future I could set up something where I do some training in dark field. Yeah, because I've done lots of training over the years in dark field microscopy, from learning from Dr. Rao. I did some training with Lynn Hinton in Toronto, and then I also did some training with Steve from Biomed X in Chicago. So with all of that, it's just kind of combined knowledge and just knowing what to look for. But I'd say even if you just come in and we take a look at your blood, you'll learn so much just from seeing your own blood underneath the microscope.
Mm-hmm. And Kayla, I believe Kayla is in the Toronto area, and Lynn Hinton with the Health House, she does offer the live blood and then the dark field microscopy courses. And if I understand correctly, she's still probably the only one or one of the only ones that actually does teach that in Canada. So that would be a really good first place to start.
Yeah, for sure. If you're in Toronto, yeah, that's a great place to start. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. All right. And so then Donna's just asking about substituting sheep or goat dairy with cow. Sometimes it depends on what the sensitivity is to, but often those are better options than cow dairy in general. So Donna, there's a little bit of information for you. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Biological Medicine one-on-one and the 101. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining the Biological Medicine 101 webinar. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for presenting and giving all of those that are listening the opportunity to learn a little bit more about biological medicine and learn some of the mindset and the theory and the understanding that goes with it, and then sharing some of your experiences that you have been learning and developing and really using to share out to everybody else in these last decades. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, and goodbye, everybody. Have a really wonderful rest of your evening. Take care.